Okay, so last time we talked, we started going over blood vessels, and so today I just wanted to go over and recap some of what we've already talked about in regards to the vessels themselves. We went over the fact that there are two circuits. When vessels move back and forth between the lungs, we refer to that as the pulmonary circuit, and when it moved to the rest of the body, referred to that as the systemic circuit. We talked about blood vessels and gave general classifications. Generally, when we refer to vessels that move away from the heart, we call those arteries. Ones that are moving to the heart, we call veins. And this is not dependent on the oxygen content of the red blood cells. It has to do primarily with the direction that the vessels are moving from the heart or to the heart. Then we talked about capillaries, which are small in nature, and they're the areas, the capillary beds that connect arteries to the veins. It's here where any of the nutrients and the items that are being carried in the blood, such as oxygen, for example, glucose, which is going to feed and help create ATP for the cells and the tissues, that's going to escape via the capillaries. Generally, the direction is from the arteries to the capillaries, and then to return or drain back into the heart via the venous system. We also noticed general characterizations of the vessels themselves. If you noticed in this image, the artery walls are thicker, the veins, the walls are thinner. Also, the lumen, the space that sits in the middle of this tube system, generally is a lot larger for the veins than it is for the arteries. When we look at the vessels themselves, the arteries and veins can have at the maximum of 3 layers, moving from inside to outside. We call these layers tunicas, and so each of these layers will begin with that actual name, tunica. The inside, we call the tunica intima. The middle layer, we called it the tunica media, and then the outside layer, we called it the tunica externa. You should be able to recognize what primarily makes up of each of these layers. The inside lining, any time we deal with lining, we're going to see endothelial cells. It's going to be made up of endothelial type tissues. And so the tunica intima follows in that it's also primarily, mostly endothelial in nature. The media is going to be primarily smooth muscles. You'll have to have connective tissue so that the smooth muscle can connect to the endothelial layer and have an established foundation. But primarily you're going to see mainly smooth muscle type cells in this tunica media layer. It's the thickest layer in arteries. It's primarily going to be involved with constricting the vessels and dilating the vessels as needed. And then the externa provides kind of a protective layer, an outside protective layer, and because of this, it's mainly connective tissue made up of collagen and elastic fibers. We see this thickest in the veins as well. This slide, we went over it, just again primarily goes over the layers. Just remember that you have the inside layers, tunica intima, medial layer, the one in the middle is the tunica media, and on the outside is the tunica externa. We went into a little bit more depth of terminologies. We basically said there were arteries. Then after arteries we have arterioles. Arterioles moved into capillaries. Then when the blood starts returning, it actually moves first through vanules and then back into veins. I'm not going to get too picky at this point whether we're going to categorize them as medium-sized to large-sized veins. Just know the general direction: arteries, arterioles, capillaries, vanules, and then veins. And this is most accurately used to describe the systemic system. And so for that purposes, we'll just keep with this direction when we refer to how blood flows. Now, I do also want to recall the fact that up near the heart, especially at the aortic arch, right where the aorta leaves the heart, it's going to be very much made up of elastic material. It's going to have a lot of elastic characteristics. If you can think about the heart as a pump, when that blood comes out of that heart, when it's pumped, there's a lot of force on these vessel walls. And so there's two things that help resist this: thickness of the arteries, especially that tunica media layer, but also the ability to give a little bit to that pressure. And so if it can elast and expand out, that's going to help reduce temporarily any pressure that's exerted when the heart contracts. This just basically reestablishes what I was talking about, the elastic arteries. It's going to have a large lumen near the heart. All this, again, is designed to basically reduce any of the pressure that's being exerted on the walls themselves when the heart contracts. Do note some of the characteristics we talked about. When we moved into the arterioles are predominantly missing, or appear to be missing, the tunica externa, and that's one characteristic that we can look at and see and say, okay, yes, that's an arteriole. And then the capillaries, basically, they're really only going to have that endothelial layer. They need to be very thin. They need to be able to allow nutrients and resources to readily pass back and forth between that layer. And so because of that, it's just going to be made up of endothelial tissue, predominantly that tunica intima. That being said, the capillaries, and it follows that the capillaries themselves are going to be thin. They're exchange vessels. This is where all the resources are being exchanged. The walls are so thin that they're actually only one cell thick. There's not a tunica media, there's not a tunica externa. Okay? And only these areas, only these capillary beds are going to permit the exchanging of resources. A couple other things to note is that around the base of some of these capillaries, as the capillary beds expand out, you're going to have these muscles called sphincters, and these are basically open and closed valves for the capillaries, and they'll direct blood as needed. Remember, we talked about flight and fight type responses. If the body needs to divert blood away, those sphincters will close up and have the blood divert away from those capillary beds. If the beds are saturated, again, those will be diverted. If there's a high demand for blood, those sphincters that will follow are going to be open. And so there's a lot of regulation by these sphincters as to how blood flows into these capillary beds. There are two categories for our capillary structures. You can have a continuous category. This type of structure basically will help permit diffusion of water in small solutes. The endothelium is a complete lining. And then you can have fenestrated, which permit rapid exchange of water, and large solutes contain pores penetrating the endothelium. And so here on the left, it's continuous. If you notice on the right, it's fenestrated. The endothelial cell size themselves very small, a lot of space in between some of these cells as compared to the continuous. And this is again designed to help some of the larger material get by. So know those two categories, continuous and fenestrated. The capillary beds, network of capillary with several connections between arterioles and venules. Again, these are sitting in between the arterioles and the venules. Again, don't forget about that sphincter. This is a band of actually, again, smooth muscle cells that's going to regulate this flow into the capillary bed. If it's closed, no blood will move into the bed and it will go directly straight off into the venule. If it's open, then yes, it will actually move into the capillary beds. And so this is again directed as the body needs, depending on whether the sympathetic or parasympathetic system is activated. And it's going to be very tissue specific when those mechanisms are activated as well. Capillary exchange in the systemic system, we'll see that oxygen and nutrients will pass from blood to the tissues, and waste products, such as those produced during respiration, and we'll get into that when we talk about breathing and lungs and lung functions, and carbon dioxide and those waste products are going to actually be passed out of the tissues back into the blood. For the pulmonary circuit, okay, for the capillaries that are part of the pulmonary circuit, oxygen is actually going to pass from the lungs to the blood. Okay, so note that difference from the systemic circuit to the pulmonary circuit and those capillaries. For the systemic circuit, oxygen moves from the blood to the tissues. From the pulmonary circuit, oxygen moves from the lung to the blood. Likewise, carbon dioxide in the systemic circuit is going to move from the blood or from the tissues to the blood, and for the pulmonary circuit, it's going to move from the blood to the lungs. Okay, and that helps us get rid of the carbon dioxide and then take in oxygen. So notice those difference between capillaries that are sitting in the systemic circuit versus the pulmonary circuit. Venules, veins. Venules, again, are small veins. They lack that tunica media. Can lack the tunica media. Very small. Collect blood from the capillaries. Okay. The veins are medium-sized veins to large-sized veins, and so that's just the next direction. So blood will be returned through the capillary bed back up to the venules and then to the veins. The function of the venous system is to return blood to the heart. Veins have specialized adaptations. They want to have a large diameter. We saw that in our image comparing the arteries versus the veins. This allows for little resistance to flow. And then they also have valves which will prevent backflow. By the time the blood gets to the venous system, the pressure that's exerted by the heart is very, very low. And so to help facilitate that blood flow back to the heart, a lot of these venous systems will be sitting in between muscles. And it's the actual muscles themselves, through their contractions, that are going to be directing this blood back to the heart. This is even more important for lower extremities, anything below the heart, because we have to go against gravity. The blood has to go against gravity. Anything above the heart, you do have that help of the gravity. Nonetheless, you still need some exertion from the muscles to help get that blood back to the heart. If there are problems with these valves, and these valves basically, when the muscles relax, helps prevent the blood from backflowing back down and pooling. But if these valves don't work, then that's exactly what happens. The blood will pool. And so if it collects in certain areas, it's going to cause these vessels to balloon. If it sits in certain areas, some of that fluid from the plasma will try to escape, and you'll have swollen areas as well if it gets too extreme. But one of the main consequences, very common consequences, pooling of the blood in certain chambers of these veins, and this will lead to varicose veins. Okay, and so they'll be swollen and they'll be quite apparent, especially superficial veins. Hemorrhoids are basically very similar in their cause due to problems with the valves themselves, and so hemorrhoids is going to result in distortion of adjacent tissue. Again, this is just to reiterate the point that veins do depend on contraction of the muscles. Here we have a vein sitting in the leg, in the skeletal muscle of the leg. We note that the gastrocnemius is in the back portion of the leg when we studied our muscle tissues. And it's the contraction of this muscle that's going to be exerted on this vessel to constrict it, force that fluid, or force that blood up. Okay, so distribution of blood. Okay, so how is blood distributed through the body? Okay, we say we have about 5 liters of blood. How is it directed? Well, at a given time, if we were to count and see where blood is in this entire system, in this circuit, And we take into account the systemic aspects of this, the pulmonary aspects, and all basically the plumbing of the heart and the cardiovascular system. We note that the heart itself will basically contain about 7% of your body's blood content. The pulmonary circuit is going to contain about 9%. The arterial system for your systemic circuit is going to contain about 13%, and then the capillaries in the systemic system will contain about 7%. Interestingly enough, most of the time, most of your blood is trying to get back to your heart to get replenished. And so your actual systemic venous system, that's going to contain about 64% of your heart. Okay? Again, think about the fact that the venous system, the lumen for the venous system is a lot larger. So, okay, you may have similar veins, amount of veins, I guess if you will, but if that lumen space is drastically increased, it's going to be able to hold a lot more blood, and that helps account for that 64% that we see in the venous system. The pulmonary circuit, unique vessel colors. Pulmonary arteries are actually blue. They actually carry deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Okay, so this is why we don't classify arteries and veins as their oxygen content, because of the fact that when we look at the pulmonary circuit, the arteries moving blood away from the heart, that blood is actually low in oxygen. They get to the lungs, they get refreshed with that oxygen in the pulmonary capillaries, and then it gets returned to the heart via the pulmonary veins. And these are going to be high in oxygen. Okay? And so because of that, they're going to be high in oxygen. They're going to return the blood back to the heart, filled up with oxygen so that it can be distributed to the body. There are a couple major vessels that we should know, at least for this slide set. We're going to go over the aorta, the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, pulmonary arteries, and pulmonary veins. So let me get out one more thing. I'll point this out to us. Okay, so where these are, the vena cavas, these are just the part of the venous system. There are two main areas. Okay, so the first one is right here. This is on top. Our terminology inferior means on top. The one below, here's our one below, and again it's feeding into the heart here. Here's the top one feeding into the heart in this area. And they're both dumping into the same chamber of the heart. This is part of the venous system, and we call these the vena cavas. The one on top is the inferior vena cava. The one on the bottom is called the the one on top is the superior vena cava. Let me correct myself. Superior means on top, inferior means below. The one below is the inferior vena cava. So up here, with my correction, this is the superior vena cava. This is the inferior vena cava. Coming out of the heart, we see in this area, okay, we see the aorta. And the aorta will actually branch, and you'll have 3 branches extending from this aorta. The other ones to note, again, you want to note the pulmonary arteries. Here's pulmonary artery. I've designated that by an X. Okay. Remember, it's blue because it's still moving away, but it's low in oxygen. And then over here, you have another X. You have your pulmonary veins, and these are high in oxygen, returning blood back to the heart, ready to get to the rest of the body. Okay, so as far as the blood vessels go, I think that'll do it for this section. When we come back, we'll go ahead and review over this. You're going to have a set of questions on Blackboard that you need to answer in relation to this slide, so make sure you get that done. I'll put your due date for that as well on that handout. All right.